We've spoken to General Naim Lodi. He is about to join.
Sir. How are you, sir? Ambassador Ayaz, can you hear me, sir?
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम, कैसे मिजाज?
क्या हाल है सर? खैरियत से? ठीक ठाक? Good to have you here, sir. Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Ambassador Johar, can you hear me? Nice to have you. Nice to see you.
Can you hear me as well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. Great. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome to this joint webinar. How's the weather there?
Great to see Ambassador Ayaz Wazir as well.
Thank you. How are you, Johar? खैरियत? ठीक हो?
बिल्कुल ठीक. आप कैसे हैं?
अल्लाह का करम, पिस्ता खाते खाते बीमार तो नहीं हुए हो? अल्लाह खुश रखे.
आपको भी शुक्रिया.
Thank you.
I think we are just waiting for a couple of more panelists. So we'll start once they are with us.
Of course, of course.
कितनी देर का है, if we know?
Sir, ये 1 hour 50 minutes का है total duration.
और अगर थोड़ी देर हो, can I take a leave of 5-10 minutes maximum?
Sure, sir. Sure. Why not?
I'll be back with you after 10 minutes, inshallah.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Okay.
No problem. Dr. Ishtiaq, welcome. We are just waiting for a couple of more participants, and when they are on board, we'll commence.
Sir, I believe most of our participants have joined. We're short of just 2 participants, and maybe we can begin with the webinar, and then they can join us in the meanwhile. With your permission, should I start?
Please.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening to our speakers and participants joining us from Italy, Pakistan, and the world over. I'm Walid Yavar, and I welcome you to today's webinar on assessing the current situation in Afghanistan. The webinar has been jointly organized by the Islamabad Policy Research Institute and the Center for International Studies, Italy, on a subject that is of relevance and extreme importance to Afghanistan, the region, and indeed the global community of nations, given the dynamically evolving chain of events on ground in the country. To speak and analyze these very dynamics, we have with us an esteemed panel of 7 speakers joining us today from Pakistan and Italy. The opening address will be delivered by Ambassador Johar Salim, followed by presentations made by the respective speakers of the webinar. The presentations will then be followed by a question and answer session. Thereafter, Acting President, Islamabad Policy Research Institute, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, will conclude the webinar with his closing remarks. A timely reminder to our audience before we commence today's proceedings, I would request all participants of the webinar to keep sending in their questions in the comment section of the YouTube live streaming of the webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers to our audience. The welcome address will be delivered by Ambassador Johar Salim, Pakistan's ambassador to Italy. The first speaker for the webinar is Mr. Andrea Margieletti, the chairman of Center for International Studies, Italy. Our second speaker is Lieutenant General Naeem Lodhi. General Khalid Naeem Lodhi, who has previously served as the Defense Secretary of Pakistan. Our third speaker for the webinar is Mr. Gennaro Migliore, who currently serves as Member Foreign Affairs Committee of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. Our fourth speaker is Ambassador Ayaz Wazir. Ambassador Ayaz Wazir has served the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pakistani missions abroad at Vienna, Maputo, Dubai, Riyadh, Mazar-e-Sharif, London, Manchester, and Doha. Our fifth speaker is Ms. Francesca Menenti, who is a senior analyst at the Center for International Studies. Following her is Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, who formerly served as Vice Chancellor of the University of Sargodha. And our final speaker for the webinar is Ms. Claudia Anovi, who is a junior fellow for the Terrorism and Radicalization Desk at the Center for International Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to a very enlightening discussion. We will now formally commence the session with the welcome address from Ambassador Johar Salim. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, G. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear.
We can hear you perfectly fine, sir.
Wonderful. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome all the participants to this webinar today, which involves 2 very prestigious think tanks, one each from Pakistan and Italy, 2 very friendly countries with multifaceted cooperation built over several decades. I may mention that in the last few days, we've had 2 webinars, which also attracted very high level of participation, including 2 former foreign secretaries, including chairpersons of the important committees of the Italian Parliament, and heads of very prestigious think tanks in Italy and Pakistan. And I'm very happy to see that this seminar has attracted same level of participation. So that augurs really well for a very well-informed and insightful discussion. The situation in Afghanistan as it stands today is before the world. It's not an ideal situation by any means, but it could have been worse. We all know that. When the US decided to leave Afghanistan a couple of years ago and engaged in a dialogue with the Taliban, many felt that that may eventually lead to either a government which includes the Taliban or perhaps a government which is dominated by the Taliban. The way things happened after that, we all saw were rather chaotic, unexpected in many ways as well. The fall of Kabul and the control of entire Afghanistan by the Taliban in just a few days after the leaving of the US troops. In fact, some of the US troops were still there and some were then called back for an evacuation operation. So that was very swift, unexpected, because a lot of projections were that the 300,000 or 325,000 strong Afghan National Army and paramilitary forces and law enforcement agencies would be able to hold the country for, some felt for years, some felt for months, some, there were different projections, of course. And we have to recall here that when the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1989, their supported regime, or puppet regime as many would call it, was able to survive for 3 more years, despite the onslaught of all the Mujahideen groups then. And that government was not really getting much support from the Soviet Union. Their army had not been built by an expense of $84 billion, as it is claimed that the Afghan National Army was built. That army did not have this type of a weaponry, which the Afghan National Army had presently, before it just melted away. So why did it happen? People have conjectured, analysts have conjectured in many different ways. But I think there is now a consensus of sorts that this whole governmental structure and the Afghan National Army, which was supposed to be many times stronger than the Taliban army. The Taliban's, after all, the estimates were that they were not more than 60 or 70,000, and their level of equipment and their level of training was not comparable at all to the Afghan National Army, which had the highest level of training and the best equipment in the world. So the consensus is, one, that the previous regime was inefficient, incompetent, corrupt, and that is why it did not really enjoy the broad-based support which is necessary to keep a regime afloat. Secondly, the army, the Afghan National Army, had no morale, was totally used to be supported by the US command and control system, the intelligence. And then, of course, some people say that President Ashraf Ghani, the frequent changes he made in the command structure of the army in the last days was also, they also turned to be disastrous. But the fact is, I think it puts to rest all those theories that Pakistan had propped the Taliban and Pakistan orchestrated what was happening in Afghanistan in terms of resistance. Because if that was the case, then how, in just a few days, this 300,000 strong army melted? The government in Kabul disappeared. After all, Pakistan has a defense budget of just $8 billion a year. How would that compare to $84 billion that's spent on that army? I think it's widely believed now, and I would just quote the statement of the last US ambassador there, who's also the special representative, Brian Croker, who said that we were not really fighting an insurgency. We were fighting corruption, a whole mafia of corruption. I'm not quoting the exact words, but that's what the words to the effect. And that was eventually which led down to which led to the fall down or demise of the entire regime. Similar opinions have been expressed by many other Americans, political leaders, as well as military leaders. For instance, in the US congressional hearing yesterday, top brass of the US armed forces expressed similar opinions. That's not important anymore, in my point of view, because the blame game, it had gone on for too long. The scapegoating of Pakistan had gone on for too long. And it was all counterproductive. I think there's now a general consensus that it didn't really help the matters at all. Pakistan had been calling for a non-military solution, a political solution. In fact, Pakistan said that that was the only solution available, an only solution which could bring about durable peace in Afghanistan. Nobody listened for many, many years. Pakistan had been saying it since 15 years or more. When the Americans and other Western powers involved, they finally listened. First of all, it was too late. Secondly, again, they did not really follow Pakistan's advice in entirety. For instance, Pakistan had advised the Americans to not withdraw hastily. Pakistan had advised a gradual withdrawal commensurate with the progress in the intra-Afghan dialogue. So as a sort of, an inclusive dispensation would have come into being gradually, so the withdrawal would have happened. But unfortunately, that was not to be. And now we all find ourselves in a situation where the Taliban are in full control of the country, whether we like it or not. There is a reality in Kabul. There's a reality in Afghanistan that we have to live with, we have to deal with. And most of all, that is a reality for Pakistan, because others, including the US, they can choose when to engage with Afghanistan, when to disengage with Afghanistan. After all, they're thousands of miles away. But Pakistan is right next to Afghanistan. We have the longest border with Afghanistan. We have the myriad cultural links, the historical links. We have the same racial stock in some ways. The majority of the population there in Afghanistan, we know, is Pashtun. In Pakistan, we have more Pashtuns than there are in Afghanistan. So whatever happens in Afghanistan has a spillover effect in Pakistan. And this is not the story of the last 5 years or 10 years. This is a story of decades and decades. We have seen that. We have experienced that. My generation grew up with that experience. Like after 79, what happened in Afghanistan had a profound impact on Pakistan. So more than anybody else, we face the consequences of what happens in Afghanistan. And that is why there is no bigger supporter in the world of peace and stability in Afghanistan. There's no country which wants it more than Pakistan, which wants to see not only a peaceful Afghanistan, but also a progressing Afghanistan, an Afghanistan on the path of development. And why is that? Because Pakistan, a country which is located on the confluence of three regions, very important regions, South Asia, Central Asia, and Middle East, wants to be the promoter of connectivity, the promoter of regional integration. But for that, Afghanistan and peace in Afghanistan is the key. We are heavily invested in connectivity. This China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the Brick and Road Initiative, it will require us to invest in total about $60 billion. And that's not a mean sum of money for a country like Pakistan. And all our dreams, our aspirations for becoming the regional hub of trade and connectivity and investment, they rest on the fruition of that project, which in turn rests on peace and stability in Afghanistan. So nobody has a greater stake in peace and stability in Afghanistan in that way than us. So how do we see the situation? First of all, we want, and we have been doing that, we've shared with our friends, our Western friends, our regional friends, the international community in general, that the way forward now is through engagement with Afghanistan, through continued engagement with Afghanistan. Because we all know what happened when the international community decided to disengage with Afghanistan in the 90s, starting 1989, when the Russians left. It was a disaster. There was a civil war in the country. The vacuum created conditions which led to harboring of all the terrorist groups that came to Afghanistan. So nobody wants to see a deja vu. And that is why it is important to stay engaged with Afghanistan. Now, everybody asks us, our friends and our partners, what should be the terms of engagement? So what we believe is that, first of all, the international community has to consult amongst itself so that it is able to evolve a coordinated approach, a common approach perhaps, because that would add to the weight of the international community. That would add to the leverage of the international community. And where does that leverage stem from? Of course, there are many things that Afghanistan would need. There are many things the Taliban regime would need. First of all, they want to seek recognition of the international community. Second of all, the country is in a dire need of humanitarian assistance. Thirdly, the country would need continued economic assistance. The country would need the funds that, for instance, that have been blocked by the US, about $10 billion. Because to stay functional, the country needs all that. No country, no government can run without money at all. No country can run without resources. In fact, people who have visited, experts who have visited Afghanistan recently, like the World Food Program President, David Beasley, they have opined that if there's no immediate humanitarian assistance provided to Afghanistan, you could see a situation where 90% of the country would become vulnerable to poverty and eventually starvation even. And that is not the situation we would want to see in the country, because that would create chaos, perhaps civil war, and huge flows, millions and millions of refugees possibly to the region. And then, of course, the pressure would eventually come to others as well. So to avert that, I think it's important, like Prime Minister Imran Khan has said, that at this point in time, we need to support Afghanistan through humanitarian assistance, through engagement, through economic assistance. But of course, in return, we need to see certain things there. And what are those? Some of those are benchmarks. Some are calling them benchmarks, some are calling them preconditions, some are calling them what, like the wish list. What are those? These are things that the Taliban have announced themselves. For instance, they have announced amnesty. They have said they will protect human rights and women's rights. They have said that they commit that they will not allow Afghanistan to be used by any terrorist groups or to be used to harm any other country. They have said they will have friendly relations with the neighbors, and so on and so forth. And these are exactly the type of things the international community wants to see in Afghanistan. And at least the Taliban have made the right noises. They've begun, let's say, on a constructive path in that way. I know there are doubts about the government, the interim government that has been set up there. A lot of my Western friends have expressed those doubts with us as well, shared with us. But we all have to remember that, first of all, it's an interim government. Second of all, The Taliban have said that they will include non-Taliban, they will include women. So, we need to give them some time. And then again, we need to incentivize good behavior by the Taliban through the leverage that we all have, the international community has. And it's not mean leverage. It's very substantial leverage. But for that, it's very, very important that we come up with this coordinated approach, like I said, if possible, a common approach, because that would increase the leverage manifold if we all act in unison or in coordination. So that is, I think, where the things stand. And within that, I know we're constrained for time, so I wouldn't really dilate upon that too long. But in conclusion, I would also mention that the US role in all this situation remains very important. I think they have to provide that leadership to the Western camp, which they normally do, and they have been doing that in the past. And I think I see many Western countries looking for that type of leadership. Again, they have to they have to come up with a constructive approach towards Afghanistan. I know and many analysts feel that they are upset, and sometimes when countries get upset, they just want to withdraw totally. But that wouldn't really help. Secondly, the role of regional countries, China, Russia, Pakistan, I've already mentioned, Iran. That is important because many of these countries are neighbors as well. So there has to be a regional approach as well, and then, of course, a more global approach. But for that, it's very important to consult each other. We see that hectic diplomacy has taken place in recent weeks. In Pakistan, we saw the foreign ministers of many European countries and many other countries visiting. The Pakistani Prime Minister visited other regional countries. Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, he had in-person discussions and virtual discussions with literally dozens of counterparts all around the world. I think that is a positive sign. Italy is thinking about having a G20 session because Italy is currently the president of G20. So Italy is contemplating a special session of G20 on Afghanistan to provide a forum for that type of consultation. So I envisage and I hope that such consultation happens, continues, and strengthens in the coming days, and the international community is able to evolve a constructive approach of engagement, which would help us all and which would also help the people of Afghanistan, because they are a very important in all this situation. They're perhaps the most important segment, and they are right now vulnerable in terms of a humanitarian catastrophe, and in terms of course, if there's no positive engagement with the Taliban, sometimes in history what happens, and those governments, they become kind of skeptical, and then they tend to sort of become more inward looking, and sometimes start paying less regard to international norms. So that is not the situation we would want to see. Well, with these comments, I would like to thank you again all for listening. And I look forward to a very healthy, very positive, constructive, and very useful debate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next up is Mr. Andrea Margieletti. Sir, you have the floor.
We can't hear you, sir.
So I believe you there's a technical issue at your end, because you are unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you now, sir.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, let me thank you. The Islamabad Policy Research Institute is an institute that we love to work with. We have a memorandum of understanding, and we want to continue to work with. Today, I will not speak just for a few minutes, and after that, to give the floor to the distinguished guest and to my staff, to my people. I will speak not about security, but I speak about BRICS. Why? We need to see forward, to go forward. I don't want to speak about the past and about the Afghanistan that we left. I can only say that we fought as Italians, Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, as the Pakistan soldiers and intelligence operatives fought the TTP in the country. So I can say that the blood of Italian soldiers is mixed with the blood of Pakistan soldiers. We are much more than connected. But we can't leave Afghanistan alone, because we can't leave Pakistan alone. We can't leave Central Asia alone. And I'm particularly proud as Italians, as advisor of Italian Ministry of Defense, for the fact that my government, the President of the Council, Mario Draghi, he strongly wanted to have a G20 with a special focus about Afghanistan. But because we have done many mistakes, and when I say we, I speak not about only the Western countries, but the international community. But having done many mistakes doesn't mean that we have to continue to do mistakes. We fought not for the stability of Afghanistan. We fought not for the stability of Pakistan. We fought for, both of us, for common values. The values of a democracy. Obviously, every country has its own menu for the democracy, but democracy is democracy. We fought for human rights. We fought for the right of the people, of the women, of the children to have education, and most of all, to have a future. And we fought for the stability, and we fought for having land of peace and not land of war. For this reason, I truly believe that if we haven't done our best in the past, now we have the occasion, the opportunity to do our best for your country, for my country, for Europe, obviously, but especially for the people that deserve our best. And I think that the meeting, like the meeting that IPRI promoted today, is a brick, is the first brick for having a new home. What we need is a common home, because we share common values. I truly believe that what the Pakistan ambassador in Italy he just said, we have done sort of things that weren't planned before. But nowadays we could steer our attention towards what we in the Ministry of Defense we call the center of gravity. Center of gravity is people. The people of Afghanistan, but let me tell you, the people also of Western countries, the people of Pakistan as well, could have the opportunity to share borders without rifles, to share borders without soldiers, but especially to share borders with economy, with values, with friendship, and with a common interest. For having these, we needed to work harder than ever. We needed to create a common environment of security for the whole area, not only for Afghanistan. And I can assure you that Shona by Shona, the Italian government, the Italian people, the Italian defense will never, ever left the people that need to be supported alone. Thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you, sir. Next, I'd like to bring in Lieutenant General Naeem Lodhi for his address. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, IPRI, Pakistan Embassy, and our Italian friends. It's a great pleasure to be interacting with them today. I think Ambassador Johar has very aptly painted the entire present picture. So I don't have much to add to that, and I would not like to go for repetition. What I'll say is that we can see a small pause in the situation as has been painted by Ambassador Johar and our Italian friend, that is understood. How can this logjam be, dissolved, or how can we get over it? That is important. And in that, I think there are a number of entities and countries, group of countries that they have to act. First of all, let us take the Taliban government, the new interim government, as we call it. Inclusive government. The world is asking for an inclusive government. Now, from the Taliban point of view, as I understand, they say that they have gone quite a long way as far as the inclusive government is concerned, because they have Tajiks, they have Uzbeks, they have Hazaras, they have Nurzais. So according to them, they have included the people who were to be included. But we need to remember one thing, that there are 34 provinces of Afghanistan, and they have yet to announce the names of the governors of those 34 provinces. And I am quite certain, and I'm quite confident that those governors will be from those areas, because otherwise it is not possible. And the government may like more inclusive as far as the world is concerned. So first, this gap has to be, shortened, or this gap has to be finished. The two sides must come closer as far as the understanding of the inclusive government is concerned. Then the other thing that the world is asking about, the women rights. Now, women rights, again, as per the Taliban, they say that their women are there on the TV screens. Their women are there in the markets. The small girls have been allowed to go to schools. The elder girls will be allowed very soon, because they are making some arrangements. They don't believe in co-education. That is their desire. We can't really force them. But as long as the education of women is concerned, they are doing something about it. And maybe because of COVID, our colleges and universities were closed, and it is very recently, 2 days back, that it opened. So if it can remain closed for another 15 days, I think it is not a big thing. Whether they should have a women minister in their cabinet. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there are 100 countries, more than 100 countries, where there are no women ministers. So why aren't we asking those countries also to have, so asking one of the most backward societies, around, asking them to bring your women as ministers, I think we can have a heart. We can wait. Women ministers will also come. If not ministers, some deputy ministers or something, happen. In my opinion, the new interim Afghan government is trying its best to make sure that they have internal consensus, internal support, because they cannot survive without that. And they're also looking for international recognition, again, because they know that they cannot survive without that. So what they have done is they have even announced an interim constitution, which they say that the constitution of Zahir Shah can be introduced. They are thinking about it, that it can be. They are in contact with all the countries. They have, traveled to Russia, to China, to Iran, to Pakistan. They have been talking to Americans at Doha. So they have that interactive capacity. So I think, and otherwise also, whenever you have to recognize a government, you have to see whether they have a control of over the area, most of the areas under their control, whether they are capable of running the government. Why not? If they have if we give them chance, only then we would know. There's another demand from them that their soil should not be used by the terrorists. A very, very genuine demand, and I think everyone wants that. For that, ladies and gentlemen, they require time. And if we incentivize them, as Ambassador Johar was saying, that we give them recognition, we provide them humanitarian aid, which many countries are providing also. We help them to build up their economy, and we allow the countries to invest there. Probably extremism will be easier to finish as far as that land is concerned. And even physically, if they have to clear the areas, it will take time, 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years. So waiting for that time, that unless you clear all the areas from Daesh and from this and that, we will not be able to. I don't know whether there was a small blink in the electricity, so I hope I am audible. So in my opinion, the present situation is well known. It is a small stalemate. Taliban, the new regime, I would say, they are waiting for the world to come up and help them in their economy, in their polity, in connectivity, in investments, and it all depends on how the world respond. What I have seen is my own, being a non-diplomat, unlike Johar Saab, probably I'll have to be a little blunt. There is a group of countries led by United States of America who do not want, I would call them detractors. They actually, I'm convinced in my heart, I may be wrong, and please forgive me for my statement. They do not want this government to succeed. And actually, if I'm allowed to go a step further, they do not want any peace in Afghanistan, because if they wanted that, they were here for 20 years with all the facilities at their disposal. So I'm convinced, and as I said, forgive me for that. So whatever the Afghan, this new interim government does, they will not come for the recognition, not very easily. There's another group of countries led by China, Russia, Pakistan, Central Asian countries, Turkey, Iran, and maybe some countries may join them in those who want to recognize this new regime, and they are even helping them, even without recognition. And some people ask that what difference the recognition will bring. It will bring a sea of difference, because then the new government will be able to send their envoys to other countries. They will the embassy staff will be changed. They will send their envoys in UN and all that. So recognition is important. So rather than trying to stall whatever they are trying to do, I think we must give them incentives. And instead of waiting for them to first, demonstrate to the world that there is no terrorism in their country, and we should help them to create those environments where they can fight this terrorism and all that. So I think the whole situation is waiting. The new regime is waiting. They are doing, of course, daily shows, but there cannot be a big change unless there's recognition by certain countries. There's a lot of debate going on in America, and I think America will only act once this debate takes some shape. It is going to take a few months, as far as I think, but I would urge the countries who are more interested in the peace in the region, connectivity in this region, led by China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Central Asian countries, please recognize them. Do not wait for America and its allies to recognize, the regime, because then it will be too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your remarks. Our next speaker is Mr. Gennaro.
Good morning, good evening to everyone. I'm really sorry, but in this moment, I'm in a place where it's impossible to leave my mask. Thanks, first of all, for the invitation, and I guess that we have to discuss very deeply about the situation, the current situation in Afghanistan, but don't forget what happened in the past and who are Talibans and who are the threats that we have for our stability, our security, and for the recognition of the human rights. First of all, I want to say that we are strongly allied of European countries and the United States of America. We discussed with them to withdraw altogether because we have an intervention in Afghanistan together and we withdraw together. Second, in addition, I want to stress that we are really aware about the situation in Afghanistan due to the violation of the human rights. And I don't forget that I don't believe that we have a new situation on these human rights, because in the recent past, after the so-called new regime of Taliban, were killed a lot of people, especially people that are involved in the previous regime, and also people that have no military or violent activity as musicians, as people that are involved as writer, or if we look to some activity against journalists that have only the duty to recognize what means to describe the reality. So we are also aware about the situation of the presence of Al-Qaeda in the new Taliban regime, and we think that Al-Qaeda is a present and a very strong threat for the security, first of all, of people that live in Afghanistan, but also for all the world, because they are a terrorist organization. For that, I don't guess that is the moment to recognize at all the new Taliban regime. I guess that it's a very fatal error to recognize this regime, believing in the possibility to have a dialogue, a political dialogue with them. We have to reduce our dialogue only at the necessary contact for people that needs security in this moment. At the same time, I think that we have to discuss deeply with the borders country, first of all with Pakistan, because I guess that the Taliban regime can be a threat also for them, especially because they are not able to control all the country. And the country is really fragmented, and a country fragmented allows the possibility to have other terrorist groups on the field in Afghanistan, like IPRI-CE.S.I, that, as everybody knows, attacks every day some Taliban and some civilians. For that, the political issue is not to stay with that country that closed the eyes on this threat and on this violation. If the new regime of Taliban want to be an international actor, have to decide on which side of history have to do. And for that, we are convinced that in this moment, the only way to prevent new instability is don't recognize the Taliban, the so-called Taliban regime. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Ambassador Ayaz Wazir. Ambassador Ayaz, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, IPRI and our friends in Italy, Ambassador Johar Salim, and all the panelists, everybody. I don't know where to start from and where to end because the Afghan problem is so complex. It's so big, it's so difficult to handle. But if you know it, like I'm sure all of us know, it's very easy to address provided we look at it with a very cool mind, not to be biased, not to take side of one side or the other, but just to look at the poor Afghan country. For 40 long years, it's on fire. Now, after 40 long years, this is the first time that an opportunity has come where, with a little accommodation on the part of the Taliban and the world at large, we can permanently restore peace in Afghanistan. The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan was extremely fast, very quick. I don't think anybody expected it that way. Even the Taliban, I'm sure, were not mentally ready for such a quick fall. But anyway, it's a history behind. Let's not waste time on that. It has happened. They have taken over. Now, the difficult job for them is the governance of that country. And the difficult job for them is the unity of the Afghan nation, is the removal of friction between the society, is bringing them on the same page, as we say, for the restoration of peace in Afghanistan. Who would know better than the Afghans themselves as to how that can be done? They are resistant to imposition from abroad. We all are a witness to their fights against foreign power occupying their country, or any suggestion or idea tried on them by force or through whatever means. They have been extremely reluctant. So my suggestion to all those who really matter would be, let's join hands with the Afghans. We may be disliking the Taliban, but that is a reality. How can we handle that reality? Should we go for killing all of them, throw them into the ocean? Is it possible? That is impossible. It can never happen. Now, how to mold that thinking, which some of my friends have said, particularly the gentleman who spoke before me, strongly against the Taliban. I am not the Taliban spokesman, but that is a reality. I recall the previous government of the Taliban, when I was still in service, we used to beg the diplomats, particularly of US and the Western countries, to engage with the Taliban, not to push them to the wall. And they didn't listen. And we know then the rest is a history what happened. Now, what we do is, as I said, whether we like the Taliban or not, they are there. They promised, or let me mention another thing. If they were so bad, like my friend said just a while before, not to recognize them or not to deal with them, then why was the sole superpower forced to enter into an agreement with an entity which declared terrorist and had put a price on their heads? Haqqani network was the worst thing to say anywhere on earth. And with them, they entered into negotiation and in Doha signed an agreement under which they left Afghanistan, and the Taliban honored that agreement, didn't harm the American right from that day till their final departure. Now, the other question was that the Taliban are to ensure that Afghanistan will not be used by any militant group against America or its ally or any other country. The Taliban are saying that they will do what they have promised, but they have just taken over the country. They have not yet been able to completely, how should I use, I'm missing the word, bring the farmer government inside their fold or be together to join hands and run the country. Only that will ensure the Taliban's complete control on the country, not to allow any militant group to use their soil against any other country. But if we refuse to recognize them, or if we refuse to deal with them, or refuse to give them any human assistance which they badly need, then I'm afraid we are moving back to the early 90s period. Was that in anybody's favor? Look at that. Or will it be in anybody's favor if the differences internally between the Taliban and their opponents within the country, there are so many, but for the time being, they are sitting quiet, waiting for the opportunity, waiting for tomorrow as to what happens. If the differences are not ironed out by the Taliban and with the help and assistance of the immediate neighbor, the regional countries, the world at large, I'm afraid that simmering will turn into a civil war. And that civil war is in nobody's interest. Pakistan will be the worst hit country of that, and the other neighboring countries also. But Europe, America, or in today's world, which has almost become a small village, who would feel safe? So let's not push them to the wall. The Taliban have many challenges, as I said, governance, human rights, women's rights to address, which they have promised they are trying to do it, and the assistance that they would need. I was listening yesterday to an Afghan on a television talk show, and I'm so happy what he said. He said, we are not facing that acute problem of human assistance that the Taliban faced in the initial days. Now our border with the immediate neighboring countries are functioning. We are getting supplies from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Pakistan. All have opened their border in addition to what assistance Pakistan provided and what China promised to provide. The only country or countries that I see are a bit reluctant, as the general said, is unfortunately our Western friends. They, I don't know, they do not like the faces or the dress of the Taliban, or why. Their attitude towards the Taliban before Doha peace agreement was totally different. Doha, when it started, it was totally different. The Taliban were then the very, very, very good people. They dealt with it. And when that happened, again, reset their position and going back, looking at the Taliban afresh. This is unfair. Another point that I would refer to, though I'm not a spokesman of the Taliban, I'm a Pakistani, and I certainly would defend my country, my government, and but would say, whatever I have learned in my service, international law applies to all the countries on equal basis. If we have no right to comment on a government of another country as to what type of a government that country should have, or what exclusivity or it should have or not, then why should we single out the Taliban or the Afghan government? Have we ever said to our immediate neighbor, look at every country, to immediate neighbor or to any other country, that you should also have all-inclusive? And is there any country on earth which is all-inclusive? Isn't the biggest democracy, America, UK, India, you name a country which is run on democratic basis, are they all inclusive? Isn't it that the winner party forms a government and the loser go into opposition? Now the Taliban have taken over the country, whether somebody likes it or not. It is by international rule, if we accept it, their choice to make a government, to run the country, and we should extend help. But they have promised that, yes, we will make it all inclusive. And today they say that it is all inclusive because we have Tajiks, Uzbek, Hazara, all the ethnicities included in our cabinet. Now, should we insist that no, that Mr. A, who is a Tajik, is not a good man, include Mr. B, who the Taliban may have their reservation? Or had we asked Ashraf Ghani's government before the Taliban to include the Taliban in their government to make it all inclusive? So by making this argument, what I am trying to say is that our focus should be to help the Afghan people, to help the government to maintain law and order in the country and give them a little better governance. They have gone for a constitution to amend it a bit so it could be more acceptable to the Afghans. I'm sure they are all, the Afghan leadership is aware of the word reaction to the human rights or to the women's rights. But that again drags me to give you an example that the power that were occupying Afghanistan, were they so concerned when they were occupying, when they were conducting night raids in Afghanistan, when they were bombing Afghanistan villages from the sky, when they were bombing wedding processions and whatnot? It's a history. Look at what happened at Abu Ghraib, what happened at Bagram. Where was the human right cry all over the world against them? But let's bury the past, it's bitter. Let's focus on the immediate problem that we are confronted with. Let's engage with the Taliban. If I can recommend, my word would be engage with the Taliban. Don't force them, don't make them stand against the wall. That will have its repercussion. So with that, I take your leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Yaz Wazir. Next up, we have Ms. Francesca Menenti for her address.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you once again for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure having this kind of discussion with the Islamic Policy Research Institute. As Professor Margieletti just said before, we have the privilege to have a memorandum of understanding for establishing a partnership with our two institutes, and we are always very eager to share our analysis with you and with our friends in Pakistan. My speech will be very short. I would like just to share with you some few points that we take into highly consideration when we have to analyze the current situation in Afghanistan. So from our perspective, which are the pillars that we are considering right now in order to understand what is the situation and hopefully how it will be developed in the future. As we know, we are a think tank, so our core business is to support the decision-making process. So this is what we look at when we do our job. So coming to Afghanistan, the first factor that is really important right now for us to understand and to look at is how much Taliban is struggling to consolidate the power. Everybody have seen the campaign of this summer and how fast in not days but months. We know that August was just the peak of the iceberg, but then in few weeks Taliban succeeded in coming back to Kabul and to gain again the power and to be officially to come back to the government in Kabul. So this was the military win and also the political win, if you want to say like that, of Taliban. But now Taliban must prove to be able to be at the government. It's easier to be at the opposition. It's easier to be maybe the insurgency for almost 20 years. But now they needed to govern, to rule the country. So first of all, they probably do their homework and do business at our among the ranks of the Taliban. We have seen with great attention the consolidation of the first interim government, and what we perceived, it was like an attempt to share officer and to share powers among Taliban, among the different factions that that has been consolidated inside Taliban in the last few years. The ambassador Wazir before me spoke about the Doha agreement. We know that not all the Taliban were on the same page regarding the possibility to have a dialogue with the international community, and especially with the US, for coming to a political settlement or to a ceasefire before thinking about the end of the war and coming back to the government. So not all the Taliban agreed on this more political line. There were more, let me say, harder position inside the Taliban who opposed this solution and would prefer to keep the military side. Well, now probably Taliban had to take into account these differences inside the groups, even if at the very last end they probably succeeded in reconcile the different position and to present a common line. Also because this common line turned to be a successful one. So the chance to be accepted, the official position by the political leadership of the Taliban, of course, were much higher in the very last months before the last August and the coming back of the Taliban than before. So when the first interim government was formed, we have seen that there were, all the right men positioned in the very right place. You know better than me the names and the position inside the Taliban. I would like just to share which are those who concern or keep our attention, get our attention the most. One for all is, of course, Siranuddin Haqqani, the number 2, but then also now the Ministry of Interior. We can discuss, how can be politically sustainable that a person who is in the international terrorist list now is also on the Ministry of Interior, but it's another page and another chapter of this discussion. Then there is the son of the Mullah Omar, who is the Minister of Defense. There were the old guard of the Taliban who got governing jobs, official job inside the group and inside this interim government. So all the people who had been rewarded actually got something in this first round of the formation of the government. But that was not enough. We have seen that there were some, power struggle inside the group, probably a fight between the Haqqani and the other part. We have to consider, and what we are seeing, our perspective is also an analytical perspective. So we try to understand. What we saw was like, resurgence of friction inside the group, who probably underlined that the group is not so much solid right now, or so much the ranks of the group are not so close, and the rumors about the future or the health of Baradar was just one of the case. The most important thing is that there was this kind of rumor. So probably someone had interest in underlining that the group is not on the same page again right now. And in fact, we have the second interim government, and more inclusive one with other ethnicity brought into the box in order to not to be just the government representative of a specific side, of a specific slice of the population, but a more broader one. And it was indeed the case. We have now Hazara, we have now Tajiks, we have now Uzbek. Also, the choice was particularly clever because there were people from, the northern area. There were more technicians that could effectively probably help the interim government to run the daily business and to try to reset up the country again, especially the public administration. But we saw also the promotion as vice minister of other, representatives of other Taliban groups. Just for saying, Qayyum Zakir was one of them. That can effectively, once again, be, the symbol, the sign that the power struggle and the necessity to award it all the people who in these 20 years supported the cause of the Taliban is still one of the points in the agenda of the current government. All this for saying that trying to keep the Taliban solid and unified in this moment, probably for the Taliban leadership, is one of the most urgent cases, because as the speakers before me pointed out, without being solid, the Taliban can't guarantee to control the country, and without the capacity to control the countries, that would be difficult to keep the promise they made to international community, but especially to regional partners in granting that after August, with the Taliban, the situation in Afghanistan and the stability in Afghanistan would have improved in quite short time. So probably nowadays one of the most important things is to try for the Taliban is not to have like these two speeds inside the group, the political leadership. In August, in European countries, in Italy, I can speak about Italy, there were these frequent asked question about are these the same Taliban compared to the 90s, or they are different now? And our answer were they are the same because Taliban are Taliban, but probably they are politically more aware. They have been matured in these 20 years, and especially let me say, the political office in Qatar, probably they learn how to, prioritize political agenda and how to, try to set a pathway for presenting the new government under a new light for being acceptable or accepted by other countries. What's the problem? Maybe that the political leadership has a very political view and political understanding of the situation, but then the military commander on the ground, the people who are on the ground, and then in these 20 years had the so-called boot on the ground, especially in the rural areas, probably they are not so or aware or in line with the political agenda implemented right now by the Taliban. And that would be the a problem for granting the control of the country, a problem for assuring that the current government could also be the guarantor of the security and the stability of the country, for preventing that new kind of radicalization or new kind of radical groups could exploit new fractures or part of the countries who are not in line with the Kabul government right now, for repeating the history once again in the country. The second point that kept our attention was how effectively the Taliban are to understand that the society, the Afghan society nowadays, has probably changed compared to the Afghan society of the 1990s. In these 20 years, of course, the presence of the international community made mistakes in Afghanistan, but something good has been made, especially when it comes to consider the development of the civil societies. Civil societies, of course, including the rights for women, the rights for in the field of education, also for children, and for female, and the possibility to access public jobs or have a political and a public engagement for a widespread part of the Afghan society. This is the society that Taliban has now the duty to rule. So how much the Taliban effectively could keep this card and to understand that the granting civil liberties or granting human rights or granting the access to the women to the public administration, to public service, also to public life could be a plus for the progress of the country, could be a plus, not just from a political point of view. General Lodi, if I'm not wrong, said that there are different countries in the world where the women are not part of the cabinet, there are no women ministries, and of course the problem is not to have or not to have women inside among ministries. It is, you know, an issue of gender balance, but this is another, again, another chapter of our discussion that we can make, but it's not now the case. The problem is to recognize that actually there are also same rights for, you know, all the people inside the population. This is probably the point that must be understood, because if in these last 20 years also women had access to education and graduated and had the chance to have, you know, jobs like being doctors, like being engineers, like being public prosecutors or judges or lawyers, and etc., etc. Now they can be also part of this new civil society that can make Afghanistan different from the country that Taliban found in the 1990s when they established their first government there. And the third point that we are taking very much into consideration is the role of the regional countries in supporting the stabilization of Afghanistan right now. Of course, also the region is very different comparing to the South Asia 20 years ago. Both for internal political reasons and for, you know, international affairs, but an Afghanistan without international connection is an Afghanistan isolated, and any government isolated is probably a government that will struggle to make the country progress and to make the countries to be developed. So the international community is still, as a whole, is still trying to understand how to approach to the new Taliban government, and probably it will not be an easy path. But the regional countries could be the first interlocutors in this. Of course, Pakistan in this process has always have a special role, and the engagement that regional countries can guarantee right now with Afghanistan and in Afghanistan can be a bridge also for the international community in order to understand how to successfully create a new policy toward Afghanistan, a new kind of relations toward Afghanistan, for the benefit, of course, first of all, in the first place, of Afghan people and population, and then to the Afghan government, that, of course, the old international community hope it will be the wider inclusive as possible. And right now, unfortunately, it is not the case, but probably Afghanistan can't be isolated, because an isolated Afghanistan would be, you know, will bring the history back to decades ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Francesca, for your remarks. Our next speaker is Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed. So we can't hear you. You're not audible.
Probably you need to unmute yourself.
So you are unmuted, Dr. Ishtiaq, you are unmuted, but we can't seem to hear you. I think there's a technical issue that. While we sort Dr. Ishtiaq's technical issue, why Okay. No, I
Waleed, I think while
so
somebody should help
we can move,
resolve that issue, we can move on and
I think we have
can
Dr.
perhaps
Ishtiaq
ask
on board
Mr.
now.
Durrani for his few comments, or could we ask Ambassador Durrani for his
Ambassador
comment while we sort out that issue?
Is it
sir,
is it okay now?
Okay, it is resolved now.
Yeah.
we have Dr. Ishtiaq on board, sir.
So thank you very much for this great opportunity. Already, a number of speakers have highlighted important issues, regarding the subject that is before us. Basically, I'm an academic for the past a couple of decades, but I started my professional career as a journalist. And one of the issues that I covered back in the 90s was the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan. So let me give you some anecdotal reference, and then I can make my fundamental points. In February 1995, late Rahimullah Yousafzai, who was then reporting for the BBC Pashto service and also for another English newspaper in Pakistan, together we went first time to Kandahar, and we spent a few days with the Taliban leadership. At that time, they had only captured 9 provinces. And I remember one night where we sat together late night with Maulvi Amir Muttaqi and other people. And I posed a question to them as to why, what kind of their feelings were. Why were they trying to engage in a war? So we noticed basically a couple of feelings among them. One was a sense of betrayal from the Americans, because there was a successful jihad back in the 1980s, and once it was over, the United States just abandoned the region and abandoned the Mujahideen and walked away. So there was a sense of betrayal, and there was a sense of pride as well of defeating a superpower, Soviet Union. So, but when you ask them a question as to why are you against the Americans now when you were collaborating with them, so they would always come up with a Machiavellian answer that, we were fighting against the greater evil, and America for us was always a lesser evil. And now we are going against the lesser evil. So 30 years down the lane, 2021, 20 years of war since 9/11 in Afghanistan, the lesser evil stands defeated. Sometime, because we have all grown in Pakistan, unlike nations of the rest of the world, because we have a huge border with Afghanistan. Almost all of us in our individual capacity have been affected by what has gone on in Afghanistan since the 1980s. Next door neighbor is an Afghan, my university student is an Afghan, somebody gets killed in the family because of the Kalashnikov culture which came from Afghanistan. So we are extremely happy as a nation that at least the 40 years old civil war is over for the past month or so. There is no fighting in Afghanistan first time. And we are also happy about the fact that at least a cross-representative, movement of Afghanistan, north, south, east, west, has finally again come in power. So whatever weaknesses were there back in the 1990s until 2001, we believe as Pakistanis, and I would argue, from a purely Pakistani standpoint, because I fundamentally believe that this is largely compatible with the global opinion as it should have been all along in the last 40 years. Why? Because if you recall the 1980s jihad against the Soviets, early attempts to bring about peace between the Mujahideen factions, and then the UN-led attempt throughout the 1990s to have a all-inclusive regime in Afghanistan, Pakistan has been on the forefront. And I would also like to argue, because history has moved forward now, and I think the only reality that is most important is twofold in Afghanistan. One is the Taliban who are in power. Second is the Afghan people. The rest, as we were telling the international community back in the 90s, and especially after 9/11, I think is history, but it is important to recall. I remember even after 9/11, it was possible to avoid war. And this is precisely what our leadership was arguing, that the issue of Bin Laden can be settled amicably. There were 3 governments which had recognized the Taliban regime. Saudi Arabia had made an attempt in early 2001 to negotiate the Bin Laden issue, but unsuccessfully. But if UAE, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, 3 important interlocutors, and if the international community had engaged with us, pressured the Taliban, or offered them some incentives, I think this issue of Al-Qaeda, including Bin Laden, could have been resolved. Once the war began and the Geneva peace process started, Pakistani argument, I remember General Musharraf's remarks, our argument was that Taliban should also find a seat. It is possible to negotiate peace. And subsequently, I think the history has been told several times throughout these 20 years. Whenever Pakistanis have given a point of view, throughout this time, the Americans have bought the opinion of India that Pakistan is the problem. And still, it is amazing that the reality is out there in the face. It is amazing that still some circles in the United States, after having been humiliated in Afghanistan, are again finding Pakistan as a scapegoat. Pakistan, I tell you, has always been a part of the solution in Afghanistan, right from the jihad in Afghanistan back in the 90s, back in the 80s, 90s transition, which led to the arrival of Taliban, and especially post 9/11, at every turning point, be it the diversion of Afghan war into Iraq and the resurgence that came in the shape of Taliban, and Pakistani articulation at that time was, this is an appropriate time to make peace again, negotiate peace with the insurgents. So anyhow, let me come back to the final points currently. You see, the choice before us, it's a great opportunity right now in Afghanistan. In the past couple of months, a great opportunity. But this opportunity, powers which do not have good intentions, be in the region or outside, they would like to turn into a challenge. How it is an opportunity? If for the first time in the last 40 years, Afghanistan has been at peace, then obviously Afghanistan is a very, very important country when it comes to this whole region of Central Asia, of South Asia, of West Asia. A great, occurrence in this region is in the form of China-Pakistan economic corridor. And the backdrop to it is again a host of regional integration projects, which began, the talk was back in the 90s, and agreements have been signed, between Turkmenistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India. There are so many other agreements and proposals pertaining to the revival of the new Silk Road. And even the Americans were in favor of this project, back in the 90s, and they also made their respective efforts. This entire regionalization basically hinges on stability and peace in Afghanistan. And this is the moment actually to bring Pakistan, Afghanistan, 3 Central Asian neighbors of Afghanistan, and states in the Caucasus, Russia, China, Iran, all together, even to the extent I would argue that even India and other countries in South Asia can be co-opted in the process. And what happens in regional integration is that countries which participate in these projects develop interlocking economic and political interests. And I think beyond that, we should also, final point I would make is that generally speaking, what the Chinese have been arguing in the context of world politics, I think is extremely important, because first time I see that we have this possibility of avoiding war and creating some kind of a stable peace in the world if we buy the Chinese, discourse on this issue, which is that I think countries should cooperate in areas which guarantee them economic progress and prosperity, which may be trade or other economic and commercial linkages and other areas of cooperation, whether it is cultural, technological, agricultural. But I think they should leave two things aside. One is traditional cultures. Whatever culture or tradition a country has, a society has, I think it has to be left to that society to determine. And secondly, the nature of political system. Because I was listening to Ambassador Ayaz Wazir and the guy who spoke before, the problem is, again, Francisca also was mentioning when she talked about, preserving the gains of the past 20 years. And I think this discourse is repeatedly emanating in Western writings and discourses. I think culture and politics is something that should be kept to the societies. And these societies have evolved over the last several centuries. And there is no standard, of modernity for every society in the world. And I think it's a great opportunity, but the window of opportunity, I would repeat what Ambassador Wazir was saying, and General Lodi also pinpointed, this window of opportunity is limiting by the day. If we aggravate the current humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan deliberately, some members of the international community or those who have some kind of revengeful or sadistic intentions about this country, then obviously this will create a political crisis. It will create a security crisis. And I think the last thing we should expect in Afghanistan to happen, and obviously it will have huge security and political implications for South Asia and the world. The last thing that we should prevent to happen is the repeat of the 1990s. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ishtaq. Our next speaker is Ms. Claudia Anovi.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly loud.
Okay. I want to thank you again for this space of opportunities for us as a Center for International Studies to discuss and to hear your interesting perspective about the Afghan political crisis. So far we have been talking about all the challenges Afghanistan is facing during this political crisis. And I would like to come back to one point the first speakers talked about, which is the presence of jihadist groups within the countries, and specifically how the Taliban return, what the Taliban return is representing in terms of changing. In fact, the Taliban return means for every actors within the global jihadist movement, somehow a watershed moment within the jihadi galaxy and within Afghanistan as well. Because on the one hand, it has reignite, fueled again different debates over specific topics, and at practical level, it has also fueled some kind of internal battles, internal conflicts within the jihadist arena. Of course, I'm talking about the presence of Al-Qaeda within Afghanistan, as well as the Islamic State, which is represented within Afghanistan by the Islamic State in the Khorasan province. So first of all, what we have been focusing on as a think tank is the specific ideological debate that this confrontational ground is creating within the jihadist arena. Because of course now we are seeing two competing models of jihad, which are represented by, on the one hand, Al-Qaeda, and on the other, the Islamic State. Of course, on the one hand, we are talking about Al-Qaeda, which is profiting from the Taliban victory, the Taliban return. And after the withdrawal of US troops, the Al-Qaeda leadership described as well the return of the Taliban as an historic victory, not only for the Taliban themselves, but also for Al-Qaeda, because it is also the success of its the moderate alternative Al-Qaeda Central has put through since the death of Osama bin Laden. Of course, we can say that the victory of the Taliban has shown also a different model of long-term jihad. Al-Qaeda has in fact demonstrated that they are working more in terms of years and in the long term, rather than in terms of territorial gains, as the Islamic State did throughout these years. And of course, another point which is characterizing the ideological debate, and the political as well, is the fact that Al-Qaeda has eventually won through the Islamic Emirate. The Islamic Emirate has won over the idea of a caliphate gathering together all the Muslims across different Muslim lands. So this is the perspective of Al-Qaeda, while on the other, it is also interesting and important to understand the complex reaction of the Islamic State regarding the Taliban resurgence within the country. We talk about the Taliban resurgence, of course, in relation to Al-Qaeda, because in this framework we are talking about a sort of shift of the ideological debate, because the Islamic State has tried to focus more on the pitfalls of Al-Qaeda. Namely, the fact that in ISIS perspective, Al-Qaeda has somehow shifted from the real path of jihad, which is abandoning Islam, and a sort of religious deviation. So they're focusing more on this type of ideological debate. And secondly, another point, another interesting perspective they're putting forward is the fact that Al-Qaeda and its allies are not the real jihadists, because they're like somehow spineless, in contrast to the hardline factions which characterize the presence of IS in the country. And the last point, of course, is, as I said before, the political debate over which form of government should Afghanistan, but the Muslim community at the Ummah as a whole take on. Now with the Al-Qaeda, we are seeing the triumph of the Islamic Emirate, while now IS is struggling to promote its form of the caliphate, gathering together all the Muslim Ummah. So against this backdrop, it is important, therefore, to also understand which are the strengths and weaknesses of both organizations on the ground now in Afghanistan. As we said before, as the speakers before said, one of the main points is that we cannot really distinguish what Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, we cannot distinguish them from one another, because throughout the last 20 years, Al-Qaeda has worked out to embed within the Taliban structure to align with its objective and its goals. So the point now, the real question is whether this kind of stricter relation, this personal relation, which also goes over the simple strategic partnership, is going to be the first point for developing a new Afghanistan as a launchpad for jihad outside of the country, not within Afghanistan. Of course, when analyzing the presence of Al-Qaeda within in Afghanistan now, after the Taliban return, we also have to take into consideration a fact that Francesca Manenti talked about previously, which is that the Taliban are really struggling to be accepted in the international arena. So this might mean like a potential deadlock in the political triumph of Al-Qaeda, because of course they might try to play down the presence of Al-Qaeda within the country in order to be accepted internationally, to be politically sustainable. Another point of which might be a deadlock, of course, for Al-Qaeda and now within the country is that, of course, they are throughout these 20 years they succeeded in building a strong network in a moment of fragility, in a moment of real weakness. But at the same time, they lack the same capacity of control over all the affiliates in the region and in other continents. On the other part, we also have to consider which is the operational capabilities of IS now in the country. I think we all remember the Kabul attacks the last month at the Kabul airport, which has shown somehow that despite all the losses, the setbacks the IS in Afghanistan has suffered throughout the years, it still has somehow resilience and strong operational capabilities, which might as well be exacerbated, improved given the US withdrawal at the end of August. At the same time, we also have to think, when thinking about IS in Afghanistan, that IS do not have the same integration, is not as embedded as the Al-Qaeda within the country, which means that it has less basis for its operation. Well, after this thinking, I would like just to end up with something we've been working on, we'll be thinking about, which is whether this Al-Qaeda and IS rivalry will stay local, will stay regional after the Taliban return, given all the strength and weaknesses, or it will somehow traduce into an international competition. For this reason, we think as a Center for International Studies that despite all the current situation, we still have to look closely which are the terrorism-related risk for Afghanistan now, and especially in terms of an exacerbation, a galvanization also of violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Claudia, for your remarks. At this point, I'd like to bring in Ambassador Asif Durrani, who's a senior research fellow at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, for his comments, as well as a possible question that you might have for the panel.
Thank you, Walid. Thank you so much. In fact, everything has been said, and it's good to see Ambassador Jawhar Salim after a long time. And I think much has been said by Ambassador Jawhar Salim, General Lodi, Ambassador Ayaz Wazir, and Professor Ishtaq. I will only flag a few points, which are: number one is there's going to be a humanitarian catastrophe, and it's not a matter of weeks, but matter of days. So this is something when we talk about humanitarian crisis. So already UN appealed, and then almost $1 billion were committed by the member states, including the United States, close to $60 million. How it will be distributed is only a matter of days. So Taliban or no Taliban, the problem is that this crisis is looking us directly in our eyes, and then we have to address it. Secondly is that when we talk about inclusiveness, so on inclusiveness, when Taliban have their own definition of inclusiveness, and the world has on, and I don't think that which United States or any Western countries, they want certain people to be inducted in the cabinet, and Taliban are going to agree, because the question is, if they have not accepted the dictate of a superpower, and if they could fight them for 2 decades, don't think it is going to be the case anymore. And so this is also, you have to keep in mind that how the Taliban are going to behave in the future. And thirdly, Taliban entered with the United States an agreement. So, and by and large, it has been mentioned earlier by the Pakistani side that Taliban have implemented the agreement, and they have not killed a single American soldier or NATO soldier ever since entering into the agreement. But America did violate, especially with regard to the UN sanction list, 1988, under which Taliban are on the sanction list. And the United States had promised that by 27th of May 2020, they will lift that sanction and they'll delist the Taliban. This has not happened till date. So this is also another issue which will be faced. But fourth thing which I want to identify is that immediate neighbors of Afghanistan are on the same page. They are on the same page with regard to recognition of Taliban. They have decided to recognize en bloc as a group, as a nation. So here, I'm afraid the United States and European countries will be isolated once the region decides that we want to recognize the Taliban. So it is up to you whether you want to be left behind or not. That is there. And fifth thing which I want to flag is that what kind of a dispensation we had during the past 2 decades, that when the United States left, everything was, was topsy-turvy. They did not leave any structure, it means. They, in fact, and the EU is equally culprit. And they did not leave, the coffers are empty. And then to add insult to injury, they have frozen the Afghanistan central bank's assets worth $9.5 billion. IMF has frozen for $460 million of tranche meant for Afghanistan. If that is the case, then it means the lines have been drawn. So if the lines have been drawn, then I think then we are not negotiating. We means that we as a region, which have direct stakes in Afghanistan, which are facing the brunt, and then the Americans who landed there along with 47 nations, mostly the NATO countries. So it means that they came here, they just wanted to punish some people, killed almost 900,000 people since 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq and all, and these are all Muslim countries, people, mind you. So if that is the case, then I think we are talking something very big, disastrous. Because if you look at President Biden's 14th April statement, which talked about the withdrawal of the American troops, then immediately he said, while we will stay engaged with Afghanistan, we will not leave Afghanistan, but at the same time now our priority is China. And with China, we'll have adversarial relationship, we will have competitive relationship, and we will have cooperative relationship. And since April onwards, things are falling in place. So I think now and then with the establishment of AUKUS, which is again a step to the Quad, and it is, in fact, you have made a white man's club of these three countries who have been the colonialists throughout their history. If that is the case, then I think we are talking something different. We are not on the same page. We are absolutely talking different. And then I think the die has been cast. So these are the things which I wanted to flag. Reason being that Afghanistan, if we are very much concerned about the people of Afghanistan, about the women of Afghanistan. So how Taliban are going to pay the salaries, 3/4 of which are teachers and health workers, of which women are almost 50%. So how their salaries will be paid? That is the problem, which I think Italy has been involved, deeply involved, as far as humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan was concerned in after the 9/11. And I've seen myself the Italian NGOs working there, and Italian embassy was very active in Afghanistan. I was there, posted there from 2005 till 2009. So those are the issues which we have to look at it dispassionately, but at the same time, we have to look at the plight of the common people. Those are the Taliban, and now when we are talking about Afghanistan, it's a conservative society. Whether we like it or not, there in America, we want to preserve the lives of the Amishis and the Mormons and others. In Europe, you have those nomads and Kuchi. I'm forgetting the terminology. So their lives are to be preserved. In our Pakistan, we say you have to preserve the culture of the Kailash and all that. Here is Afghanistan, which is actually their mindset is somewhere in the 18th or 19th century, where vanquished and the victor psyche prevails. So here despite American peasant for the past 2 decades, they only, in fact, promoted corruption. Afghanistan became the narco state. It is the world's highest production of opium took place when Americans were in Afghanistan. So, and the sufferer is Europe, because the heroin is a $50 billion market in Europe, 10% of which returns to Afghanistan, which means $5 billion. Who of Afghanistan was benefiting from that? And so how we can expect that those people who were supported by the Americans and the NATO, they would sue for peace, when for them this war economy suited them more, and they were the rent seekers. They would not want peace in the country. And that's why the result is you find that everything is empty. As if they came, they just conquered the place, and they plundered the place, and they left. So this is something we have to look at it from dispassionately. Here, if we want to make country positions or group positions, then I'm afraid it is not going to resolve the problem, while the crisis is looming. And it is only a matter of days, I said, especially in the northern Afghanistan, which will be freezing. Already the winters have set in. So this is what I wanted to highlight. The rest of the politics, whether they are recognized or not, that is besides the point. Whether we want to stay and engage with the Taliban or not, I'm not concerned about. But I'm more concerned about the common people and what to do, whether we like it or not. Right now, Taliban are there. They are a reality, and they are Afghans. They are not someone who could be puppets of anyone. If Taliban are puppets of Pakistan, then we have to change the history of Afghanistan, that they are fiercely independent people. If Karzai could not be in our pocket, or Shafghani could not be in our pocket, who are Afghans, then Taliban are Afghans. They cannot be. You cannot dictate them terms. Forget it. So this is something I think we have to look at it dispassionately. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gone a little overboard with the time. The allotted time, so we'll have to forego with the question and answer session. I apologize to members of the audience who have sent in their questions. We'll try to address them in our upcoming webinars. And to close the webinar now, I'll pass the floor on to the acting president of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, for his closing remarks.
Thanks, Walid. His Excellency Ambassador Johar and distinguished panelists, I think a very absorbing discourse, and I'm thankful to both the think tanks and especially the Embassy of Pakistan in Rome, which has been very proactive, and it's very encouraging to see an embassy which is engrossed in its own affairs coming out for such intellectual conclaves, which gives us a lot of heart that we can continue this interaction in future as well. When we do a little recap of the whole discourse, I remember General Lodi, he mentioned the external and internal consolidation need for Taliban government. And the same sentiments were echoed by Ambassador Ayaz when he said that let us trust Afghans because they know their reality. I think this sentence just about sums the entire reality of Afghanistan, that we should not try and put socks on an octopus. It's a homespun endogenous reality, and Afghans know how to govern themselves, how to build their nations. I think sometime back, 18 months ago, when the whole process started, the Doha Agreement, the Americans, they got in touch with the reality, and they understood that their nation building effort that was futile, spread over 2 decades, and they have expended over $2 trillion, and they have failed to remodel and re-engineer a society as per their own ideals. And once they realized, they entered into a discussion, and the Doha Agreement was the result. Now, once the Americans have understood that reality, now, and having decided to leave, why that reality is not being given a chance to live up to its promises and demonstrate that the nation can best be built by Afghans themselves. So I think I leave this as a food for thought for international community, that once a government which is promising to put its house in order, it is promising to take care of its ungoverned spaces and those entities which are universally reviled as terrorists, and we are the greatest affectees. We know ISK is a terrorist entity. We know Al-Qaeda, it is a terrorist entity. And they have serious differences with Taliban as well. So Taliban, contrary to popular perception, they are not a monolith. There is a old guard which represents Habibullah. There is a Doha group, which is very moderate and which entered into an agreement. Then there is a foot soldiers group. And there's yet another group which comprises their erstwhile financiers and helpers while they were fighting an occupation force, according to their understanding. Now, these all elements, disparate elements, have to be kept on board. And what General Lodi was mentioning, that internal consolidation is a big challenge. And this definition of inclusivity by those who want to impose a solution might in fact open up the seams and create problems. Because once we say inclusive, we should also remember 2 decades ago, there was a triumvirate of 3 Tajiks, Yunus Kanuni, Abdullah, and Marshal Fahim. These three Tajiks were running the whole Northern Alliance and Ashraf Ghani's government. And look where that led us. That was as far away from inclusivity as an Eskimo is from equator. So the international community must understand the limitations of Taliban and their capabilities also. No country would be worst affected if instability takes hold in Afghanistan. And Pakistan is cognizant of that reality. It is pushing very hard for a regional solution. And humanitarian aid also. I think the responsibility is of international community now to understand for itself the actual reality that Americans understood 18 months ago and ultimately decided to cut their losses and disengage. And having disengaged, now it's a greater responsibility that devolves upon them as well as the international community to engage with an entity which has come into power as a de facto reality and is trying to translate itself into a de jure reality. So with these few words, I once again thank the Embassy of Rome, the management of IPRI-CE.S.I, and our distinguished panelists for a very, very educative and enlightening discourse. I thank you all, sir.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of today's webinar on assessing the current situation in Afghanistan. I also would like to extend my gratitude to both the Center for International Studies and the Embassy of Pakistan in Rome for their coordination in this webinar as well as their participation. Please do follow IPRI on its social media accounts for any updates on research work and publications and events. Thank you once again for your participation, and Allah Hafiz.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you, Ambassador Asif.
Leave webinar. Recording stop.